Hello, everyone, and to those of you in the room and to those of you online, thank you very much for joining us here at CSIS. Our topic today is extremism in the West. One thing about that topic is about every 5 years, I think probably even more quickly than that, the challenge of extremism seems to change, right? It doesn't get better, it just gets bigger. Many of us who began focusing on these issues began in a post-9/11 era where the focus was on groups like Al-Qaeda and then later the Islamic State. Later there was an emphasis on white supremacist and anti-government groups. And of course, since October 7th, there's been concern about how the October 7th attacks and the Israeli response are radicalizing and galvanizing audiences really around the world. I'm delighted today that we have a fantastic speaker to educate us on these issues. It is Robin Simcox. He is the Commissioner for Countering Extremism in the United Kingdom. He, for many years, was also I'm not sure I'd say proud member, but a member of our broader think tank community here in Washington, where we were pleased to have him among our ranks before he went to higher service in government. And he's going to speak to us, and then we'll have both audience and online Q&A. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Simcox.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for the warm introduction. It's a great pleasure to be with you all today and at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. CSIS has a well-earned international reputation for bringing independent thought and a bipartisan spirit to some of the world's most pressing national security challenges. The Commission for Countering Extremism, the organization I lead, is an independent body that provides the UK government with impartial advice and scrutiny on how to tackle extremism. And I come today with a simple message. Extremism in the West is being driven by international influencers, both terrorist organizations and hostile states. Yes, the primary drivers might be local, and believe me, the UK has plenty of homegrown extremism. We focus on it intently every day. But it is increasingly hard to argue that extremism in the West is only a homegrown phenomenon, because what may seem like a solely local issue is time and again being manipulated and exacerbated by international actors. These actors often use soft power tactics, choosing to co-opt rather than coerce in their attempts to influence communities. Countering state threats is, of course, not inherently the same as countering extremism. Yet rather than this era of great power competition sitting entirely separately to that of the post-9/11 mission to combat terrorism and counter violent extremism, it's my contention that there is more crossover than previously imagined. I would characterize the challenge as twofold. There are those actors that reach directly into the West, looking to stir up extremism, and then there are those who stir up extremism simply by setting an example to follow. I will start with a topic that is driving this conversation back home, and I believe to an extent here as well, Hamas and the war in Gaza. The terror attacks committed by Hamas against Israel on the 7th of October were the single deadliest attack against Jews since the Holocaust, and second only to 9/11 for the most American civilians killed in a single terrorist attack. Every day, the war between Israel and Hamas allows extremists to sow seeds of further division. Take a look at the protests taking place on the streets of London, and you will see the majority looking to protest peacefully. But you'll see a minority who are open in their support for Hamas and seem to enjoy the carnage that was wrought in Israel, who carry placards of hand gliders who call for jihad. Some express support for the Houthis, a group that I have little doubt that most protesters were even aware existed until recently, let alone have any grasp of their broader ideology. There are echoes here of how the Sunni insurgency in post-2003 Iraq was viewed by the coalition that emerged in the West between the far left and certain Islamist groups. Many in those protests were simply against the war in Iraq, yet there was a smaller section who were willing to excuse acts of terrorist violence. Support for Hamas being expressed on British streets may be a surprise to some, but perhaps it should not be. After all, Hamas has tapped into those sentiments before, and with some success. 2 British nationals carried out a suicide bombing in Tel Aviv in 2003, killing 3 and wounding 50 others. The attack was claimed by Hamas. So the example Hamas is setting is seen as a legitimate act of resistance by pockets of Western audiences. I think this serves as a profound challenge for policymakers. Let me move on to another example, in Pakistan. In 2011, Salman Taseer, the governor of Punjab, was assassinated by his own bodyguard, someone called Mumtaz Qadri. That was because he opposed Pakistani blasphemy laws. Qadri's act inspired others. For example, Tehreek Labak Pakistan, or TLP, was founded in 2015 as a pro-Qadri group. They campaigned for the preservation of Pakistan's blasphemy laws, spread inflammatory rhetoric, and inspire the extrajudicial lynching and killing of purported blasphemers. Since Qadri's execution in 2016, I have seen an increase in blasphemy-related activity across Europe, often inspired by the TLP. In September 2020, Zahir Mahmoud attempted to murder 2 men in Paris whom he believed to be associated with Charlie Hebdo magazine, which, in its equal opportunities approach to mocking all religions, has previously ridiculed Islam. His attack was, in part, inspired by watching YouTube videos of Rizvi. TLP and Rizvi supporters have developed an online and physical presence in the UK. I have seen a corresponding rise in the rate of anti-blasphemy incidents involving threats to safety. This has included protests at schools and cinemas, and even the targeting of Muslims who do not go along with TLP's hardline views on theology. It's important to clarify that this is not directed at Pakistan per se, which partners with the UK on a variety of issues, nor its people. My concern here is over a specific organisation and its influence within the UK. Again, the extremist group sets the example, others take up the call for action, largely unprompted or directed. Now go over the border, Afghanistan and the Taliban. There is no ambiguity as to what worldview the Taliban holds. Their rule brings the destruction of cultural artifacts, the corporal punishment of prisoners, and the oppression of women. Yet since the fall of Kabul, I have heard voices from different sectors claiming that the Taliban has restored law and order in Afghanistan, that their ascension to power is a net positive. A UK delegation of imams and scholars, supported by a British charity, even travelled to Kabul to meet with Taliban officials last year. Both in Afghanistan and when hosted at a British university upon their return to the UK, members of this delegation praised aspects of the Taliban's approach to governance and the supposed security it had brought about. Again, you see how the Taliban set a darkly inspiring example for others to follow. They are not directing terrorist action like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. They're letting their actions do the talking. So what about those who do try and take more direct action, who reach into the West, trying to drive extremism in order to weaken democracy's internal cohesion? Well, pro-Russia narratives are increasingly common among the extreme right wing, or what is known here as racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism, or REMV. And there is evidence that Russia has encouraged extreme right-wing conspiracies to amplify and embolden its narrative. In 2022, the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament assessed that it was highly likely that Russia perceived exerting influence via far-right groups as an effective way to exacerbate tensions in the West. Of course, the war in Ukraine is a key part of that. Yet extreme right-wing groups, at least in the UK, remain fractured and fragmented. Therefore, the Russian invasion of Ukraine also proved to be contentious among the extreme right. Some criticized Putin's use of Chechens, using Muslims to fight what they thought the extreme right see as a white Christian war. Other elements of the extreme right supported the Ukraine people's overt displays of nationalism. So as ever with the extreme right, the picture is chaotic. Then there is China. In 2022, the heads of the FBI and MI5 called China the biggest threat to our economic and national security. But they're not really traditionally seen as posing an extremism challenge. Yet I was struck by the comments made earlier this year by the State Department's Deputy Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. The Washington Post reported him saying that, quote, "What we saw after October 7th was a drastic change in social media within China. Anti-Semitism became more unplugged, more free-flowing. And because we know that the Chinese internet is not free, that's a conscious decision by the Chinese government." So this included state-controlled Chinese media outlets spreading conspiracy theories about the American Jewish community and viral videos on Chinese social media which compared Jews to Nazis. And, as the Post pointed out, hateful content from China does not stay in China. Then there is TikTok, owned by a Chinese parent company. TikTok has almost 200 million monthly active users in the US and over 17 million in the UK. I am aware this is a very live conversation here, and I don't want to get into the debate about the need for TikTok to find a US buyer or potentially face a nationwide ban. But put aside the very real concerns about Chinese access to data for a moment. Quite obviously, TikTok is not used by most people for extremism purposes. But we've already received a warning about how and why this matters from an extremism perspective. Consider the recent episode concerning Osama bin Laden's letter to the American people, his tract justifying 9/11, and how influencers on X helped make what was previously relatively obscure content originally posted on TikTok and sympathizing with bin Laden's stance go viral. Look, the existence of such material is hardly new. Clearly, however, social media puts rocket boosters on its dissemination. I want to finish on Iran. According to MI5, there have been at least 15 credible threats from Iran to kill or kidnap British or UK-based individuals since 2022. Just last year, an independent Persian language news channel temporarily suspended operations in the UK because the Metropolitan Police warned staff of an increase in credible threats from the Iranian security forces. The US is not immune to the threat Iran poses domestically either, far from it. In 2021, the FBI foiled attempts by Iranian intelligence to kidnap an Iranian-American journalist. In 2022, charges were brought against a member of the IRGC for allegedly plotting to target former National Security Advisor John Bolton and former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And both the UK and the US were united in horror in August 2022 at the attempted assassination of Sir Salman Rushdie at a public lecture in New York. But look beyond the acts of violence. Look beyond the acts of violence and you see Iran spreads its influence in the UK through sermons delivered by receptive clerics at mosques they control, television channels, charities, educational institutes, and online disinformation campaigns. Organisations based in the UK, which are both directly and indirectly linked to Iran, share the aims and objectives of the Iranian regime. They praise Hezbollah and describe the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps' Qasem Soleimani as a martyr following his death in a US drone strike in 2020. The IRGC is a designated foreign terrorist organisation in the US. Yet while the UK has worked alongside the US to place sanctions on units within the IRGC representatives were hosted by UK institutions in 2020 and 2021. This was and remains perfectly legal, as the IRGC is not considered a terrorist organisation in the UK. It's not my role to get involved in the bilateral relationship between the UK and Iran, but it is my role to identify extremist threats to the UK. In my view, the IRGC passes that bar. So the purpose of my introductory remarks today has been to provide a snapshot into how extremism in the West is being inspired and being driven in part by international influences. It's my view that great power competition and the need to counter violent extremism, while, of course, are not one and the same, cannot also be cleanly separated out. Those working in government and those on the front line of counter-extremism must understand the dynamic and increasingly international nature of the challenge. We can and must do better at managing this risk. We must recognize modes of operation, whether that is to hide behind charities, to manipulate social media, or to stoke up false grievance narratives. This will help us protect not just local communities from extremist ideologies, but our democracies. Yes, hostile state actors and terrorist groups will likely still continue to try and influence our political discourse. But I say that not in a spirit of defeat, but as a challenge. Our societies are more polarized than they once were. And while I still believe we have shared values, they do need champions. When extremist ideologies threaten us, there must be voices willing and able to robustly defend all that is good about our way of life. Our success relies on a shared recognition and ultimately defense of these core values. Thank you.
I'm going to begin with some questions of my own, but for those online, if you'd like to ask Mr. Simcox questions, please use the Q&A function, and those will be conveyed to me. For those in the room, we have a microphone in back, so please don't hesitate to line up behind it. If you have a question, I would ask that you introduce yourself in your question, just so we know who is asking it. But let me begin with the very kind of basic US-UK difference. Your job could not exist in the United States, right? That the way the US legal system is structured, extremism is considered really just part of our broader free speech environment. And any attempt to kind of push back against that is fiercely resisted by people on very different political persuasions. Presumably you think your job should exist. And assuming, let's go with that assumption, what is the US missing, and what would you say about that kind of transatlantic difference?
Well, yeah, the first thing I would say is that I was making comments recently about the post 7th of October landscape and said I thought that the extremism challenge was more pronounced, far more pronounced than it was when I took the job on 3 years ago, which as far as things to put on your CV go isn't fantastic advertisement for my performance so far, but I'd like to think that there are factors far beyond me that are driving that. It's very clear that the US approach and the First Amendment precludes so much of the work we do as a commission. I understand there is a concern about the politicization of extremism. To be frank, I share those concerns at times, which is why I think, from my point of view, I have been really, really keen to ensure that we stay laser focused on the issues that really matter. It's my view that if everything is an extremism challenge, if everybody is an extremist, then nobody is an extremist. And so we have got to really, really carefully ensure that provocative or dissenting commentary or contrarian views, whether right, left, or wherever it may be on the political spectrum, don't get wrapped up and described and dismissed as extremist by those who may have a stake in trying to dismiss views they don't like. At the same time, I think it is reasonable for the state, and I obviously serve as the Home Office's independent advisor on extremism, I think it is reasonable for the state to have an interest in groups that operate below the terrorism and criminal threshold, but who, for example, have very similar ideologies or close to identical ideologies as groups that operate as terrorists, because so often that relationship between extremism and terrorism and extremism and violence is there. You can't entirely separate those two things out and wish them away. And so I'm aware that this is almost impossible to advance as a challenge in the US, but in Europe, obviously a very different picture. And so the UK, but not just the UK, has been willing to take quite a forward-leaning approach into taking on groups that operate that have free speech operate not breaking any laws, but that the state views could radicalize others, and that it should look to mitigate the harmful nature of their activities.
Thank you. Kind of staying on that topic, recently the UK announced a new definition of extremism. And as I understand the debate, it's gotten some criticism, right? And people have raised the question of, could legitimate speech be cast as extremism? Could legitimate worship be cast as extremism? Can you comment on this definition and address those concerns?
The definition of extremism question is, whenever it comes up in the UK, gosh, it's fiercely fought over. I mean, and I understand why, because the stakes in this are quite high for the reasons I outlined in the previous answer. We absolutely have to defend free speech, and when legitimate opinion starts getting dubbed extremist, it's ruinous stuff. My view on this has been for some time that if the UK government was going to go back to the well in trying to come up with a new definition of extremism, because there was one from 2011, which is, I think it's fair to say, not universally loved in the UK. But if it's going to go back and trying to redo that definition, there has to be a really clear purpose behind it. Previously, when the UK government tried to looked at this, I think it was 2015, there was an attempt to put extremism in the statute books. It proved impossible. And so they had to step back from those plans. But of course, this definition that exists now will not be statutory. It doesn't have any current legal footing. It's essentially guidance for government to use. My view is that at the moment, the extremism definition is tied to another piece of work, which is government's ongoing attempts to ensure that it no longer provides funding or legitimacy to groups of extremist concern. This is something that's been raised in reviews going back to at least 2011. So the Prevent review of 2011, and this is the Preventing Violent Extremism programme that we have in the UK. 2011, the Counter Extremism Strategy of 2015, and then the latest independent review of Prevent in 2023, all outline this problem that the government keeps, for whatever reason, but mainly accidentally, essentially, keeps funding groups of extremist concern, and that's undermining our overall fight against extremism. And so the definition is an attempt to give the government some framework to prevent those things happening again in the future. Obviously, there is a lot of the definition, as I expected, is going to be fiercely fought over. But that piece of work, the need to stop giving taxpayer money to extremist groups, that is really important. And it's been important for well over a decade. It's been a problem for decades in the UK. And so regardless of whether there's a definition or not, we need to fix that.
One last question. And again, a reminder, please, for those online, use the Q&A function for your questions. So because the United States has, shall we say, a very open free speech environment, there's a lot of rhetoric in the United States that would be considered quite troubling if it were in other countries. But the way the information environment works is that it's a global information environment. So US speakers, when they talk about white supremacy, when they talk about Islamic extremism, it can go around the world. I've heard people basically say that the United States is effectively the Saudi Arabia of kind of white supremacist rhetoric and anti-government rhetoric. That a lot of the criticisms the United States made after 9/11 of Saudi Arabia in terms of having preachers give radical speeches, of money going to other causes, that the United States does this, and it's protected by US free speech laws. Is that a fair criticism? And what would you urge the United States to consider in this regard?
Well, I wouldn't like to draw an equivalence between the United States and Saudi Arabia for all the challenges the United States faces. It's still there are differences in the governance that I think and approaches to governance which we should obviously acknowledge. I think that we should not overestimate the extent to which what is quite inflammatory and compelling in a US setting necessarily translates to European audiences or beyond. I'm aware that there is obviously, hugely, the cultural dominance of the United States feels more pronounced than ever. And the United States, obviously, what happens in the United States obviously has such an influence elsewhere. But when I look at my job and the things that really concern me on the extreme right-wing perspective, not much of it's driven by the United States, not really. I know that well, let me give you an example. Extreme right-wing issues in the UK, what are the hot topics they really care about and look to exploit? They look to exploit immigration and the small boats issue, so questions of asylum, people coming into the UK via the Channel. They look to exploit quite specific British phenomenon, like people in this room may or may not be aware, there was something called the grooming gang scandal in the UK, which involved younger girls being abused by older men, sometimes of Pakistani or South Asian heritage. And this became a really, as you can imagine, just the most contentious and controversial topic to try and address, and touched upon all sorts of sensitivities. They're British issues. The American white supremacist movement wouldn't have much to say about that, I don't think. And I'm not dismissive of the idea that there's some kind of osmosis and American concepts don't bleed their way into UK extreme right-wing rhetoric. Of course they do. But when I think of the issues that are exploited by the extreme right-wing in the UK, time and time again, they're really very British ones, as opposed to something that the American experience is necessarily very applicable to. So definitely not complacent about it, but it isn't what drives my concerns on the extreme right-wing front in the UK.
I'm going to go to some questions online right now. So first one we have notes that in the United States, Australia, and other Western countries, extremism actors are increasingly younger. First of all, is that true in the UK? And the questioner would also like your thoughts on why this shift may be occurring.
So the answer is yes, with an asterisk. There's definitely more young people are being driven into the PREVENT program. So the PREVENT program is the early intervention program, essentially to turn people who may be heading down a terrorist path away from it, providing them all sorts of ideological, social, mental health support to ensure that they don't ruin their lives and that of others around them. I think it's also fair to say that a referral into PREVENT it's not foolproof in terms of you'd have no guarantee that somebody referred into PREVENT would have gone on to commit a terrorist attack or become radicalised. But certainly those referrals are tracking younger and younger. There's no question about that. And you also see younger people convicted in UK courts, say for possession of extreme right-wing material. I do think this is quite an extreme right-wing focused topic. I don't quite see the same thing happening with the Islamist extremism challenge, for example, and other ideologies. The one thing I would add on top of that, though, is look at the profile of those who've committed attacks in the UK from the extreme right wing. Much older. Darren Osborne of recent years, I believe the youngest to be Darren Osborne, who committed an attack outside a mosque in 2017, I believe he was 46. But we've had the assassin of Joe Cox, MP, Labour MP, much older. There was a firebombing of a migrant centre, again, much older. And so you've got that really interesting disparity between where PREVENT is and where some of the convictions are taking place, which is, as the questioner rightly points to, is getting younger. Then the actual attacks taking place in the UK are from, it's essentially like people close to retirement age, you know? And as to why younger people might be more pulled pulled into this. I mean, I'm not one of those people whose answer to everything is the online question, but it seems impossible for me to believe that the online factor isn't really significant on that. Mm-hmm. I mean, just the dissemination of material, the access to it, the volume that's produced, the kind of influence that there seems to be more influencers than ever that pop up all the time now, and more social media channels. I just think it has to be a big factor.
Another online question is that addresses social media, so let me follow up with that. You mentioned that social media serves as kind of rocket boosters for extremist messaging. How do you combat that risk? And more broadly, how should democracies think about their openness and its vulnerabilities to both internal but also external forces?
It gets back to that. It gets back to the free speech question again, doesn't it? Because there is I don't have a great faith, for example, in the idea that AI is going to fix all this, that AI will become so smart that it would remove any kind of content that you wouldn't want up there. First of all, I've got concerns that we all may have very different views in this room about where the line should be in terms of what is acceptable to be online and what requires content takedown. I also feel like the division between online and offline is becoming ever more artificial, that that as a study it may not survive contact with reality for decades to come, because I mean, right now, Dan, are you online or offline?
Right. No, fair enough. I am looking at my phone for questions and also talking to Robin. Right.
But it seems to me to get to the point, and I don't really know if I mean, I think this would technically be an online question asked, but it's been asked by the person right in front of me. Mm-hmm. So I think that governments are going to have to deal with this beyond the prism of just the online challenge, which I know is the kind of is the approach of the day. But as I say, I'm just not sure I'm just not sure how sustainable that is.
Another related question I'll bring up, which is, given Russia's past attempts to try to manipulate the information environments in Western democracies, notably in 2016 in the United States, but also in numerous elections throughout Europe, also in the UK, things like the Brexit vote, among others. How is there a way to resist that? Is there a way to hold Russia accountable, or is this simply something we're going to have to live with as elections go on?
Well, the UK has been, and the UK has spoken alongside the US about attempts by the Russians to interfere in the UK election process. Obviously, I know I lived here between 2016 to 2020. It was impossible for me to ever put on cable news without there being some story about Russian election interference. Essentially, it felt like it consumed this town for a few years. The UK has taken some steps around this. There's something called the National Security Act. It's aware of the issue. I think we're all aware of the issue. I think that the one thing I've not quite satisfied myself with the answer on yet is, and this is relevant to the Iranian question as well, because I mentioned some of the Iranian online disinformation campaigns. They're pretty crude, some of these, and the extent to which they're really successful so far, I mean, maybe there are smarter or more informed people than me that have the answer to this. I personally just am not that satisfied yet that I really understand how effective Russia has been on this. I know for sure that they are players, but I just wouldn't want there to be, I feel there is I wouldn't want to say how large this instinct goes across the population, but I think there's maybe been a bit of a tendency at times to dismiss votes that people don't go the way they expect to be Russian. That it was the Russians to blame. And of course I know the Russians are involved in some of this stuff, but I think we'll be undermining our own ability to fight back against this kind of interference if we then lose faith ourselves in our electoral prospect and say, well, we're at the whims of what Vladimir Putin wakes up and decides to do one day.
That's A cheery thought. Shifting topics slightly, which is, you mentioned the Hamas October 7th attacks and the response to the Israeli reactions. Have you seen it go beyond extremist rhetoric and actually fuel extremist attacks, whether in the UK or elsewhere?
Not yet, no. I think it's a live concern. I think it's something that is being assessed on an ongoing basis as to what are the consequences. I mean, I think that the consequences of what happened on the 7th of October are going to be with us for many, many years to come. I think when I see the energy on the streets of the UK at the moment, when I see some of the anger, I can only compare it to that post 9/11 period, maybe going a little bit to the post-Iraq or the lead up to the Iraq War. It seems completely improbable to me that what happened on the 7th of October will not have very clear and potentially severe ramifications for the domestic security of the UK. Not after what we've seen happen over the last 2 decades with various ebbs and flows of Islamist extremist threats in the UK. The idea that something as potentially impactful as the attacks on 7th of October wouldn't lead to an increased domestic security threat, I just can't see how that would be. I should also say I can't give you a list of terrorist plots averted yet that would prove me to be right. It's an instinct, and one that I fear I will be right on, but we'll have to revisit it in years to come.
Fair enough. We have a question in the room, please.
Xander Palmer, CSIS. Something we've seen in our research and heard from practitioners is that there has been inspiration drawn kind of by right-wing groups, left-wing groups from these Islamist groups overseas. Is this something you're seeing as well? Kind of how have Islamist groups like the Taliban inspired groups that don't share their ideology? Thank you.
Yeah, I have seen some of that in terms of social media content you see online. What an unlikely convergence of alliance, the Taliban and the extreme right wing. But there seems to be some kind of extreme right wing subculture. I'm not sure how large or how deep the roots really, but that views the Taliban, patriotically kicking the Americans out of their homeland as being some sort of source of inspiration. I mean, I am surprised constantly in this job at the intricacies and the nuances of all these different extremist movements I look at. But even allowing for that, the idea that the Taliban and the extreme right wing would be somehow become buddies online was a surprising one to me. I've got to say, with that sort of stuff, I don't know how I see it, and I'm aware analysts are looking at it. I don't really know how seriously to take it from a kind of actual, what does this mean for, what happens on the streets, the threat level, hate crime, things like that. My sense is it probably is quite ephemeral, and is of something that's of vague interest rather than something especially consequential. But again, it's one to keep an eye on, I think.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, my name is Irma. I'm from Start University of Maryland. My question is, how does UK define climate change extremism?
How does UK define what, sorry?
Climate change extremism.
Oh, well, I don't think there's one specific definition that captures it all. I know that the UK has it wouldn't categorise it as climate change extremism, but there is a recognition and I think some interest in how activism around environmental issues might have step over into extremism and maybe even potentially acts of terrorism in the future. In the UK, we have a group called Just Stop Oil, for example, that are very active in blocking roads or disrupting people's, and I think you have a similar phenomenon in the United States as well, or defacing public pieces of art or interrupting public performances with that kind of thing. It's disruption rather than rather than acts of violence. But the point I think I would make on it is that this speaks to the importance of responsible rhetoric on this topic. I think that if there is a constant drumbeat of alarmism and apocalypticism about the imminent destruction of the world, which sometimes some of the conversation around climate change I think can kind of lean into, I don't think you should be massively surprised if maybe some young people out there take that seriously and think, well, I better do something pretty severe about that, because we're talking about the destruction of our planet. So I think it's not one of those areas that's like a huge priority for the government at the moment. Although I know there is an independent review separately going on in the UK looking at some of this subject that's going to be published soon. But it is one of those, I think it's one of those emerging areas that we are, or at least watching with interest to see how it develops.
Please.
Thank you. Kate Fisher, Channel 4 News in the UK. I just wanted to go back to what you were saying. Since January the 7th, there have been these small numbers of protesters with troubling views. And do you think what the UK government's announced today goes far enough to tackle that? Do you think there should have been more specific recommendations on protests? And second part of that question, you've said in the past that you're concerned about no-go areas for Jewish people in central London since these protests have started. Can you expand a bit on that?
Yeah, so, I mean, in terms of the protests themselves, I mean, it's, the Met and the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister take a view on these. In terms of whether, I don't think it would be, if the extremism definition just becomes so broad that everyone that turns up to a protest becomes extremist, that would come back to my comments at the start. I think it would be generally unhelpful. On the no-go zone question, which is, I acknowledge, is a tough subject to talk about. It's a tough one for me to raise. I saw the reaction from members of the Jewish communities in the aftermath. I saw there was a letter in the Times from the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, which said that it was tough to hear, but that I was correct. I saw the Community Security Trust, I'd paraphrase slightly Mark Gardner's comments, but he said, well, I don't go to the protests. My family wouldn't go to London when the protests are on. My colleagues wouldn't. None of my friends would. And so I think that's a pretty sobering thing for us as a country to have to reckon with. It comes back to the question about competing rights, and I tried to raise this in the original article. Is there a right for the protest to be in central London for how long? For infinity? For as long as the war in Gaza takes place? Or do, at some stage, the rights of Jewish communities to be able to come back and be safe come to the fore? Sorry, I'm losing my voice, but you know what I'm saying.
It's hard, though, isn't it, to keep to not make further divisions, essentially, and not rile up, make the situation worse by suggesting that people aren't safe.
I just try and tell the truth, I mean, I speak to communities and I try and convey what I see.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to go to an online question, and then I'll go back to. One of our online audience asks, how do you deal with extremist ideas when they're put forward by mainstream figures? The person online, includes former President Trump, Elon Musk, Tucker Carlson, as people who have mainstreamed some extremist ideas such as white nationalism, xenophobia, pro-Russia sentiment, who have massive influence, and ignoring the particular individuals, but just that broader question of how high-profile public individuals who say hateful things How do we think about that in an extremism context?
It's not quite as, it's just not quite as, it's not quite as common in the UK. I can see why in the US. I'm trying to think who the, what the vague equivalent would be. You do get some people who say there's like a mainstreaming of extremism. I just feel like it's not especially prevalent. And certainly that, like, I fear the consequences of this further, of saying, if we start saying like mainstream politicians are extremist or extremist sentiments, I'd have to have a very high bar, essentially, to start making that argument. It's not implausible. I mean, we have some MPs in the House of Commons with some quite specific views. But again, like I come back to my point of like, I want to be really careful about who and who is not an extremist. And if we start getting into like, members of parliament or just people who write for the Daily Mail as being extremists, then I just think we're undermining the whole effort.
Fair enough. Please.
Hi, Aiden Aronoff, CSIS. I should have come up earlier because that was pretty much my exact same question. I guess I would tailor it to how your office works on dealing with sources of extremism, and how a lot of research, particularly since January 6th in the US, has been on those government officials being a source of radicalization. And while that kind of rhetoric, as you just said, it may not be as common in the UK, I think that there is that link between rhetoric and as a source of radicalization. So I guess I was wondering, as your office, which is designed to look at more external sources, such as like charities and organizations like you talked about, how an office such as yours might navigate government officials being a source of radicalization, even if you may not label them themselves as extremists.
I mean, rhetoric definitely matters. To use a example at the most extreme end, the rhetoric of Anwar al-Awlaki, Yemeni American al-Qaeda preacher, even before he joined al-Qaeda was clearly, even before he joined a foreign terrorist group, was clearly influential within American communities and was clearly adding to the overall terrorist threat. So we can't possibly disaggregate those two things, and I've seen obviously a huge outpouring post 7th of October of extraordinarily virulent rhetoric being aired about subjects pertinent to the war in Gaza. The question would be like, and how, so the question is like, how mainstream is it, or?
Yeah, I guess my question is more tailored to when the sources of that rhetoric are in government themselves, and how your office might navigate that difference between looking at external rhetoric versus internal rhetoric to be the source of radicalization.
Right. Bye, everyone. We're out of time. With great subtlety, great care, I would have to yeah. It's not something that's impossible to imagine, and I think there are elements of it I see already in the UK, but in the position I'm in, I'd have to be really, really careful around that. I hope, and it's not a very satisfactory answer, I know, but forgive me some discretion.
Another question that's come up. One, if you want to call it ideology, that's emerged in the last 10 years is violent misogyny that's often lumped under the kind of violent incel movement. Is that something that you think of when you think of extremism? Is that kind of violent misogyny, or is that, in some ways a bridge too far for president?
I think so. I mean, look through the extreme right-wing groups, Islamist groups. They are definitely misogynistic, and so it's a factor, it's a character, and it's a feature within a lot of the groups I do look at. It seems very clear that. But I also think if I was to start looking to capture misogyny in of itself without that extremism framework, without saying, okay, how does this relate into other groups that are of concern, that have maybe ideological extremism frameworks that dictate their actions, I think I'd be taking on too much. I mean, I don't view it as being a central part of the extremism question, really. It's obviously something of significant concern, but it's also one of those things that if my office takes on all of this stuff, again, I think it dents the effectiveness of what extremism is, and misogyny is one of those social harms that needs to be combated, and I am always glad when I see people trying to do it. But I think if it's one of those things that rests with my office as a subject matter in of itself, I think it muddies the water too much about what extremism is.
A question came up online on the PREVENT program. And it notes that it focuses on individual radicalization. And there are questions. One is simply your thoughts on how productive this program has been. And then related, would it be better to actually focus on kind of broader factors that influence communities rather than focusing on the individual level?
Well, the second part of it, the focus on communities, that's important, but I think it's for another part of government. PREVENT is a counter-terrorism program. It has to remain focused on counter-terrorism. And if it focuses too much on the community cohesion side and local dynamic, I mean, they're important, they're not irrelevant, completely disconnected to the counter-terrorism question. But you can imagine the accusation will be, well, this is a securitization of communities. Mm-hmm. This is PREVENT expanding its remit and essentially like quasi-criminalizing communities. So I think that has to belong elsewhere in government. I think PREVENT's focus on ideology is right. I think the program is much needed. If it didn't exist, we'd have to create it. It's a pretty established part of the UK counterterrorism overall architecture now. Its sophistication, I think, is increasing through the longer it runs, and it's not perfect, and it's going to make mistakes. And I should say, by the way, that I have a stake in this. We recently, my commission created a unit called the Standards and Compliance Unit, which means that we have independent oversight of PREVENT as a program. We can field complaints. We can look at areas where PREVENT has gone off track, is no longer delivering to ministerial priorities. So I am aware it is by no means faultless, and I'm sure through this work I will see even more the areas in which PREVENT can be improved. But I think it's really conceptually important, and I think that the idea that the state should essentially ignore or overlook or not have an interest if they spot someone going down a potential path to radicalization. Too many people have died in the UK, to be honest, over the past few decades for me to ever accept that. It's an attempt to avert further mass casualty attacks, and so for that reason, among many others, it has my support as a program.
Let me ask you a question that's every official's dream. If suddenly your budget increased substantially, or the budget of programs you support, like PREVENT, where would you want to put the other money, the additional money? Where do you think additional investment would really pay off?
The UK having more money. Already I'm defeated by the concept of this. I just can't imagine why you'd ask such a question. From my point of view, I look at, inevitably, our focus is mainly on Islamist and the extreme right wing. It's the primary terrorism threat, it's the primary extremism threat. But I just feel like the amount of intricacies and nuances and tensions that exist within the extraordinary multi-ethnic, diverse country that we have in the UK, as I was alluding to earlier, I'm sort of surprised by it every day. There was a flare-up in the East Midlands a couple of years ago between what some say is a kind of Hindu nationalist ideology called Hindutva and local Muslim communities. And I just remember thinking that it led to, there's now an official inquiry looking into this and some of the violence that took place around it. I just remember thinking at the time, gosh, government didn't see that coming. We had no idea that, the government had no idea that was coming. And I then spoke to people on the ground in the wake of this, and I said, oh yeah, we could have told you this was coming. And there's such a gap there. And I was really taken by the fact this gap existed. And maybe there's some people are being wise after the event, but I was struck by the idea that there was so little knowledge around what was happening. And that makes me think of the other things I've missed. You know, do I have a really granular, in-depth assessment of, I suppose, community by community, what the response is to 7th of October, differences among nationalities in the UK about how they feel about it. There's so much more that could be done, I think, from a sentiment tracking question on all these different extremism and ideological challenges we face in the UK. And obviously, there just isn't anything like the time, the capacity or money or, I mean, they're big, pieces of work, and you want to track sentiment over years and see how it develops. I think it'd be fascinating to do. I'm always focused on what's coming around the corner and what have we missed, because we keep getting surprised time and time again. I know that we're going to be surprised in the future, and a part of the work that the CCE does is trying to do that horizon scanning as much as we can, because we feel like we have an obligation to be able to raise flags to government wherever we can ahead of time. But it's not an easy one, but that's probably what I'd, with the phantom money, that's probably what I would do with it.
We're near the end of our time, but let me ask one last question from online, which I think is a good closing question. What gives you hope for the future?
That's a good question. The extremist questions, the issues I focus on become bigger because it's all I do all day, every day is looking at the bleak stuff, but they're still pretty small in number. It can feel bigger, feels bigger at times like this because, gosh, the atmosphere after 7th of October is so it's so febrile, and there's so much tension in the air, and people are angry, and communities feel like there's unease in the air in the UK, and the atmospherics just I think are as tough as I can remember in a long time. But you still have to remind yourself that generally most people in this country are not extremists, don't believe in extremist ideologies, want to get on with their life and have no interest in persecuting or removing the rights of others. And so, the UK, for all its challenges, and I think the same with this country as well, we give ourselves a hard time, and sometimes we're right to do so because we're all deeply flawed as countries. But these are also fantastic places to live, and we have so much to be proud of in terms of, our past, which I know is checkered, complicated, and we have screwed up many times in the past, sometimes in very profound ways. But there's still great places to live, and we still offer amazing opportunities for people who live here. And so I've retained real faith and pride in our democracies, and that really is why this job is so important to me, because I think there's so much about our societies that is worth protecting, and extremists look to undermine that, which is why I think that the mission is so vital, and the idea pushing back against those extremist sentiments and being able to do so and having something good to defend is what gives me hope.
I think that's a nice optimistic note to end on. Thank you very much for a very stimulating conversation today. And before we adjourn, please join me in thanking Mr. Simcox for a wonderful afternoon.